Sarah Merritt folded that letter 3 times before she finally let herself cry. Not from sadness. She'd used up most of those tears years ago. But from something she hadn't felt in so long, she almost didn't recognize it. Hope. And hope, she knew, was the most dangerous thing a woman like her could carry. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button right now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The summer of 1874 didn't ask permission before it arrived. It came hard and dry and mean, the way most things came to Harlow, Texas, without warning and without mercy. Sarah Merritt had lived in Harlow long enough to know that the town had 2 kinds of people, those who belonged and those who were simply endured. She had spent the better part of her 34 years being endured. She was behind the counter of Greer's General Store when Dolly Marsh walked in, fanning herself with a church bulletin and wearing that particular expression she reserved for gossip she considered a public service. "Sarah." Dolly didn't say good morning. She never did. "You hear about the Aldridge family over in Bitterroot?" Sarah didn't look up from the bolts of calico she was refolding. "Can't say I have." "Terrible thing." Dolly set her basket on the counter like she owned the place. "Clara Aldridge passed. Nearly a year ago now. Left that man, what's his name? Caleb, I think. Left him with 6 children and a cattle ranch, and not a single soul to help him manage any of it." She paused for effect. 6 children, Sarah. Can you imagine? Sarah kept her hands moving. "Sounds hard." "He put an ad in the Bitterroot Gazette, looking for a woman to come help manage the house, care for the children. Decent wages, room and board." Dolly lowered her voice, just enough to make it clear she was about to say something unkind. "I told my sister you'd think a man in that position might consider remarrying, but I suppose not every woman is willing to step into that situation. 6 children." She said it again like it was a life sentence. "And a man still grieving besides." Sarah set down the calico. "Is there something you came in to buy, Dolly?" Dolly blinked. "A spool of white thread. 20 cents. After Dolly left, the store felt quieter than it should have. Sarah stood at the counter for a long moment, then walked to the small back room where old Mr. Greer kept the mail sorted in a battered wooden box. She hadn't checked it in 2 days. Most of what arrived for her was nothing. A circular from a seed catalog, the occasional bill. But there, tucked between a hardware receipt and a folded newspaper, was an envelope addressed in a careful, deliberate hand. Miss Sarah Merritt, care of Greer's General Store, Harlow, Texas. She didn't recognize the handwriting. The return address said simply, C. Stone, Bitterroot, Texas. She stood there in the back room, in the heat, in the half-dark, and she opened it. Dear Miss Merritt, I am writing to you on the recommendation of Reverend Hollis, who tells me you are a woman of strong character and reliable disposition. I am a cattleman in Bitterroot, recently widowed, with 6 children ranging in age from 4 to 15. I am not looking for a wife. I am looking for someone capable, honest, and patient enough to help me raise my children and manage my household while I work the ranch. The position includes room, board, and fair wages. If you are interested and available, I would be grateful to hear from you. Respectfully, Caleb Stone. Sarah read it twice. Then she folded it, slid it into her apron pocket, and walked back out to the counter. She didn't tell anyone. Not that day. It was Mabel Greer who found out first, the way Mabel always found out things, by being present in rooms where she wasn't expected. "That the ad from the paper?" Mabel asked, nodding at Sarah's apron pocket 2 days later. She was 60, wide-shouldered, and had never once in her life pretended not to know something she knew. "The Stone Man over in Bitterroot?" "It is," Sarah said. "You thinking about going?" Sarah hesitated. I'm thinking about it. Mabel was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's got 6 children, you know." "I know. And he ain't looking for a wife, just help." "I know that too." Mabel looked at her steadily. "Then what's stopping you?" Sarah didn't answer right away. She straightened a row of canned goods that didn't need straightening. "I've never raised children, Mabel. Not my own. Not anyone else's." The older woman's expression didn't change. "No," she said carefully. "You haven't." That was all she said. But Sarah heard everything underneath it. The soft, unspoken acknowledgement of what everyone in Harlow knew and no one ever said directly. That Sarah Merritt had been married once, for 2 years, to a man named Thomas, who had eventually left her, not because he stopped caring, but because she could not give him a child. That the doctor in Abilene had told her, plain and without kindness, that she was barren. That Thomas had told her, with slightly more kindness, but the same plain result, that he needed a family he could build, and she wasn't the woman who could give him one. That had been 6 years ago. Thomas was remarried now, somewhere up in Kansas. He had 3 children. She'd heard it from Dolly Marsh, naturally. 6 kids is a lot for one person to manage, Sarah said finally. "It is," Mabel agreed, "which is why that man is asking for help." Sarah wrote back to Caleb Stone that same evening. She sat at the small desk in her rented room above the feed store, with the window open and the heat pressing in from every side. And she wrote 2 drafts before she settled on one that she thought sounded like herself, and not like someone performing the idea of competence. She told him she was 34, that she had no children of her own, that she had worked in a general store for 3 years, and before that had kept house for an elderly widow in Abilene for 2. That she was not afraid of hard work, that she was good with numbers, and that she could cook a decent meal and manage a household budget. She did not mention Thomas. She did not mention why she had no children. She folded the letter, sealed it, and mailed it before she could talk herself out of it. 3 weeks passed. She had almost convinced herself that no reply was coming, had even started to feel the particular relief of a decision unmade, when the letter arrived. "Miss Merritt, your letter is exactly what I was hoping to receive. I would like to offer you the position, if you are willing. I can send a wagon to Harlow on the 14th of July, if that suits you. The work is hard, and the children are not easy. I will not pretend otherwise. But the pay is fair, and the house is decent. I hope you'll come. C. Stone." It was the line, "The children are not easy," that decided her. Any man willing to say that plainly, without dressing it up, was a man she could work for. She told Mabel first. "Good," Mabel said, and that was all. But she pressed Sarah's hand for a moment before she let go, and that meant more than a speech would have. She told Dolly Marsh only because she knew the woman would hear it anyway, and it was better to control the telling. "Bitterroot," Dolly said, with the tone of someone hearing bad news. "That's a hard place. And 6 children." "You've mentioned the number," Sarah said. "I'm just saying, Dolly." Sarah kept her voice level. "I've heard everything you're going to say. I've said most of it to myself already. I'm going anyway." Dolly looked at her for a long moment, something moving behind her eyes that wasn't quite respect, but was in that direction. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose a woman in your situation doesn't have much to lose." Sarah picked up her package and walked out. She didn't cry until she was back in her room with the door shut, and even then, it wasn't about Dolly. It was about that phrase, "a woman in your situation." She'd been hearing some version of it for 6 years. She was tired of being a situation. She was tired of being something that happened to a person and then defined them forever after. She wanted to be something else. She didn't know what yet, but she wanted to find out. The 14th of July arrived with a heat that made the air shimmer above the street like water. Sarah had 2 bags and a small trunk. She stood outside Greer's at 7:30 in the morning, and the wagon from Bitterroot arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. The driver was not Caleb Stone. He was an older man, lean and weathered, with a tobacco-stained beard and eyes that assessed her with the kind of frank efficiency she associated with men who had spent their lives judging the quality of horses and fence lines. He climbed down from the wagon, took off his hat, and said, "You Miss Merritt?" "I am." "Tom Grady. I work for Mr. Stone. He sent me to fetch you." He looked at her bags. "That all you got?" "That's all." He nodded like she'd passed some kind of test, loaded her trunk without being asked, and handed her up into the wagon with the businesslike courtesy of a man who had been raised to be polite, but didn't see the need to make a performance of it. They were out of Harlow before 9. The road to Bitterroot was long and flat and relentless. Tom Grady was not a conversational man, which suited Sarah fine. She had her own thoughts to keep her company. About an hour in, he said, without preamble, "6 kids." "So I've been told." "Emma's the oldest, 15. She's got strong opinions." "I'd expect that from a 15-year-old girl who lost her mother." Tom glanced at her sideways. "Mr. Stone didn't tell you much in his letters, I reckon." "He told me the work was hard and the children weren't easy. I appreciated his honesty." Another sidelong look. "He's a private man, doesn't say much. But he works harder than any 2 men I've known, and he loves those kids even when they're driving him half out of his mind." A pause. "Which is most of the time." "How long ago did Mrs. Stone pass?" "Going on 14 months now. Clara was—" He stopped, started again. "She was a good woman. Those kids were the center of her whole world. When she went, it was like the whole ranch just—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They rode in silence for a while. "Does he know?" Sarah asked eventually. "Mr. Stone, does he know that I don't have children of my own? That I haven't raised anyone?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "He knows what was in your letter." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "I suppose it ain't." Another pause. "He needs someone who'll stay, Miss Merritt. That's the main thing. He's had 2 women come out before you. One left after 3 days. Other one lasted 2 weeks. Sarah felt something tighten in her chest. "Why did they leave?" Tom shifted the reins. "Emma." The Stone Ranch appeared in the late afternoon, when the sun had dropped low enough to turn everything gold and hard. The house was larger than Sarah had expected, a proper 2-story, weathered but solid, with a wide porch that ran the length of the front. There were outbuildings, a barn, a bunkhouse in the distance, cattle in the far pasture. It was a working ranch, a real one, not the kind of place a man ran alone. Tom pulled the wagon up to the front of the house and set the brake. Before he could climb down, the front door opened and children spilled out. Not all at once, but in a staggered, uncertain way, like they'd been watching from the window and had argued about whether to come out. Sarah counted them automatically. 2 boys, 4 girls, ranging from what looked like 4 years old to the oldest, who stood apart from the others on the edge of the porch, with her arms folded and her expression closed as a locked door. Emma. Sarah stepped down from the wagon without waiting for help. She smoothed her skirt, looked at the children, and said, "Hello, I'm Sarah Merritt. I'm glad to meet you all." The younger ones looked at her with the careful, neutral faces of children who had learned not to invest too quickly. The 4-year-old, a girl with her thumb hovering near her mouth, stared with frank, unfiltered curiosity. Emma said nothing. Then a voice came from behind the children, from the doorway, and Caleb Stone walked out onto his porch. He was not what she'd pictured. She didn't know exactly what she'd pictured, But it hadn't been this. A tall man in his late 30s, broad-shouldered and trail-worn, with dark eyes that looked at her the way a man looks at something he genuinely cannot read. He had the kind of face that had once been younger, but had worked its way into something harder and more permanent. His jaw was set. His hat was in his hand. "Miss Merritt," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "You made it." "I did," she said. He came down the porch steps and stood in front of her. And for a moment, they just looked at each other, the way two people do when they've exchanged letters but never met, taking the measure of something that had only existed in words until now. "I appreciate you coming," he said. "I know it's a long way from Harlow." "I didn't have much keeping me there." Something shifted in his expression. Not pity, something more complicated than that. He nodded. Then he turned to the children. "This is Miss Merritt. She's going to be helping us out around here. I expect you to treat her with respect." His eyes moved briefly to Emma. "All of you." Emma looked at Sarah directly for the first time. Her gaze was not hostile exactly. It was measuring, testing. The way a person looks at something they've already decided they don't trust, but are willing to be proved wrong by. Sarah met her eyes and held them. She didn't smile. She didn't look away. After a moment, Emma turned and went back inside without a word. Caleb watched her go. Something crossed his face that Sarah recognized. The exhaustion of a parent who loves a child deeply and has run out of ways to reach them. He started. "She doesn't have to like me," Sarah said quietly. "Not today." He looked at her. "No, I suppose not." He paused. "I hope you mean that." "I don't say things I don't mean, Mr. Stone." He studied her for another moment. Then he said, "All right, Miss Merritt. Let's get you settled in." Her room was small and clean, at the end of the upstairs hallway, the farthest from the children's rooms, which she suspected was intentional, a kind of trial period boundary. There was a window that faced east, a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small dresser. Someone had put a tin cup of wildflowers on the sill. She stood looking at the flowers for a moment. Then the door pushed open. Not a knock, just opened. And the small one, the 4-year-old, was standing in the doorway in her nightdress, even though it was still an hour until supper. "Are you the new lady?" the child asked. "I am. My name's Sarah. What's yours?" "Lily." The child looked at the flowers. "I put those there. Papa said we should make your room nice." Sarah felt something shift in her chest, quiet and dangerous, the way hope always felt when it started to take hold without her permission. "Thank you, Lily. That was very kind." Lily looked at her with the solemn, unguarded directness of a very small child. "The other ladies didn't stay," she said. "Are you going to stay?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Sarah crouched down so she was at eye level with the girl. She looked at her steadily. "I plan to," she said. "Emma says you won't." Emma might be surprised. Lily considered this with great seriousness. Then she nodded once, apparently satisfied, and padded back down the hallway in her bare feet. Sarah stood up. She crossed to the window and looked out at the ranch, the land spreading flat and gold and enormous in the evening heat, the cattle like dark shapes in the far distance, the sky beginning to turn colors at its edges. She had nothing here. No history, no roots, no one who knew her or had already decided what she was. She had nothing here. And that, she realized, was exactly the point. She set her bag on the bed and began to unpack. Supper that first night was a quiet war. Sarah had offered to cook, and Caleb had let her. Not eagerly, but with the careful neutrality of a man who had learned not to refuse help when it was standing right in front of him. She found her way around the kitchen without asking too many questions, because she understood instinctively that asking too many questions in a stranger's house was its own kind of intrusion. She worked with what she found: beans, cornbread, a cut of salt pork that she fried up with onion. Simple food. Honest food. When she called them to the table, they came, all six, and sat in their places with the mechanical precision of children who had been eating in assigned seats their whole lives. Caleb sat at the head. She took the chair nearest the kitchen without being told, because someone had to. For a while, the only sounds were the scrape of spoons and the occasional clink of a cup. Then the boy, Daniel, 12 years old with his father's dark eyes and a jaw that was already practicing being stubborn, looked up and said, "This ain't how Mama made the beans." The table went still. Sarah looked at him directly. "I imagine not," she said. "I never met your Mama. I don't know how she made them." Daniel stared at her like he was waiting for her to apologize or explain herself further. She did neither. She just held his gaze, steady and calm, and after a moment, he looked back down at his plate. Across the table, Emma hadn't touched her food. Caleb cleared his throat. "Daniel, that's enough." "I was just saying." "I heard what you were saying." Caleb's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Eat your supper." Daniel ate. The rest of the meal passed without incident, which Sarah took as a modest victory. Lily, sitting 2 seats down, had eaten everything on her plate and was studying Sarah with the open, unself-conscious attention of a child who had not yet learned to pretend she wasn't curious. The 2 middle girls, Ruth, 9, and Grace, 7, were quieter, watching without committing. The baby of the family, a boy named Will, who was 6 and missing his 2 front teeth, had fallen asleep against Emma's arm before he'd finished half his cornbread. Emma hadn't said a single word. After supper, Caleb helped Sarah clear the table, which seemed to surprise the children more than anything else she'd done. He stacked the plates without ceremony and carried them to the kitchen, and when Sarah followed him in, they stood together at the wash basin for a moment, in the specific, awkward proximity of 2 people who don't know yet what kind of rhythm they're going to find together. "Thank you for supper," he said. "It was plain." "Plain's fine." He set the plates down. "We've been eating burned beans and cold biscuits for the better part of 3 months. Plain is more than fine." She almost smiled. Almost. "Who's been cooking?" "Emma. Best she could manage. She's 15, not a cook." A pause. "She's going to fight you on the kitchen." "I know." He looked at her sideways. "You sure you know?" "Mr. Stone," Sarah turned to face him, "I have been a woman in a world that told me I wasn't enough for most of my adult life. A 15-year-old girl is not going to be the thing that breaks me." He was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face shifted. Not softness exactly, but the edges of it. "All right," he said. "I believe you." The kitchen fight came the next morning before the sun was fully up. Sarah had risen early, built the fire, and was mixing batter for hotcakes when Emma appeared in the doorway, fully dressed, her hair already braided, wearing an expression that said she had been awake half the night rehearsing this conversation. "I do breakfast," Emma said. Sarah didn't stop stirring. "Good morning." "I said I do breakfast." "I heard you." Sarah poured the first round of batter onto the griddle. "You're welcome to help." "I don't want to help. This is my kitchen." Sarah looked up then, not with irritation, not with the condescending patience of an adult managing a child, but with something level and real. "Your daddy hired me to run this household, Emma. That includes the kitchen. Now I'm not here to push you out, but I'm not going to stand in the corner and watch either." Emma's jaw tightened. "The last woman who came in here tried to rearrange my mama's cupboards. I haven't touched a single cupboard. Yet." Sarah held her gaze. "If I ever move something that was your mama's, I'll tell you before I do it. And if you say no, I'll leave it where it is. Is that fair?" Emma searched her face for the trick in it. There wasn't one. "Why would you do that?" "Because this was her home," Sarah said simply. "And it's still yours." She slid the first hot cake onto a plate. "Now, do you know how to flip these, or are you going to stand in that doorway all morning?" A long pause. Emma walked into the kitchen, took the spatula out of Sarah's hand, and flipped the hotcakes without a word. It wasn't acceptance. It wasn't even close. But it was something. By the end of the first week, Sarah had established the shape of her days. Up before the children, fire built, breakfast started. School lessons at the kitchen table for Ruth and Grace and Will, who attended the schoolhouse in town 3 days a week and needed minding on the other 2. Laundry on Tuesdays, mending in the evenings. Daniel had chores that took him out to the barn with Caleb, and Emma had designated herself Will's keeper in the afternoons, which Sarah let stand without argument because it was one less battle and Emma needed to feel necessary. She was careful. She did not try too hard. She did not perform warmth. She just worked, steadily and without complaint. And she watched. She watched Daniel, who was angry in the specific, unfocused way of a boy who didn't know where to put his grief and had chosen defiance as a placeholder. She watched Ruth and Grace, who were closer to healing than their siblings, but still flinched at sudden loud noises and went quiet whenever anyone said their mother's name. She watched Will, who was young enough that the loss had settled into him like a kind of baseline sadness he didn't fully understand. He was a happy child, mostly, but there were moments when he would stop in the middle of playing and just stand still, like he was trying to remember something. And she watched Emma, who did everything, absolutely everything, like she was trying to prove something to someone who wasn't there anymore. On Thursday of that first week, Sarah came into the barn in the late afternoon to find Emma sitting in the corner on an overturned feed bucket, holding a small piece of fabric in both hands and just staring at it. She didn't look up when Sarah came in. She knew someone was there. She just didn't care enough to hide. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment. Then she walked in and sat down on a bale of hay 10 feet away. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask questions. She just sat there. After a while, Emma said, without looking up, "It was my mama's apron. Just a piece of it. The rest wore out." Her voice was flat, controlled, a voice that had gotten used to controlling itself. "I found it in the rag bin, and I cut it out before someone used it." "That was smart," Sarah said. Emma looked up. She'd been expecting something else. Sympathy, maybe, or a platitude. The simple agreement threw her. "She used to let me help her cook," she said, "before she got sick. She'd tie this apron on me, even though it went all the way to my feet, and she'd say—" Her voice broke, just slightly, like a crack in plaster. She pressed her lips together. "She said I was going to be the best cook in 3 counties someday." "Were you?" Emma blinked. "Was I what?" "Getting good at it." Something moved in Emma's face. Surprise. Then something that was almost, briefly, almost a smile. "I burned the beans every single time." "So did I, the first year." Emma looked at her. "You burn beans?" Ruined a pot so bad I had to throw the whole thing out. The widow I worked for in Abilene didn't speak to me for 2 days." Emma was quiet for a moment. Then, carefully, like she was making a decision about something, "My mama burned things too. She just never told anyone." "Smart woman," Sarah said. Emma looked back down at the piece of apron fabric. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter. "I'm not trying to be difficult. I know. It's just—" She stopped, started again. "Every time somebody new comes in, they try to change everything. And it feels like they're trying to—" She couldn't finish it. "Like they're trying to make her easier to forget," Sarah said. Emma looked up sharply. "I'm not going to do that," Sarah said. She kept her voice quiet and even. "I don't want to replace your mama. I couldn't, even if I tried. I'm just here to help keep this family running until you're all steady enough to do it yourselves." She paused. "And you already are, mostly. You just don't know it yet." Emma stared at her for a long moment. Then she dropped her eyes back to the piece of fabric. "I still don't know if I want you here," she said. "That's fair," Sarah said. And that was the end of that conversation. But something had shifted. Not much, but something. The first time Sarah saw Caleb Stone come close to breaking was on a Friday night, 10 days after she'd arrived. She was up late, mending by lamplight in the kitchen, when she heard him come in from the barn. He was usually in bed before she stopped working. He rose at 4 in the morning and worked until dark, and the hours in between didn't leave much room for staying awake past 9. So when she heard his boots in the doorway and looked up to find him standing there, she knew something was wrong. He looked wrecked. Not dramatically, not the way people looked in stories, just quietly, thoroughly exhausted in a way that had moved past the body and into the bones. He stood there for a moment like he didn't entirely remember why he'd come inside. "Sit down," she said. He looked at her like he was going to argue. Then he sat down. She poured him a cup of coffee without asking. He wrapped his hands around it and stared at the table. "Cole Davis came by today," he said finally. She didn't know the name, but she kept her face neutral. "And?" "He wants to buy the southeast pasture. 3rd time he's asked." Caleb's voice was flat, controlled in the way Emma's was controlled, and suddenly she understood where the girl had learned it. "He made it clearer this time, about what happens if I keep saying no." "Clearer how?" His jaw tightened. "He's been talking to the bank about my loan. There are men in this county who can make a man's finances very complicated if they take the notion to." He set the cup down. "He wants that land because it sits on top of the best water source in the county, and he's been buying up parcels all around me for 2 years. Sarah was quiet for a moment. "And if he gets that pasture?" "Then I lose access to the water. And without the water—" He stopped. He didn't need to finish it. "How much time do you have?" "The loan comes due in 4 months." He looked up at her then, directly, for the first time since he'd sat down. His eyes were exhausted and honest, and a little desperate, in the way of a man who had not spoken this plainly to another person in a long time. "I've been working this ranch for 11 years. My father worked it before me. Clara is buried in the south corner of the property." His voice was steady, barely. "I'm not selling." "Then we figure out another way," Sarah said. He looked at her. "We?" She held his gaze. "You hired me to help manage this household, Mr. Stone. A household that doesn't have a ranch under it isn't much of a household. So yes, we." He studied her for a long moment. Then he said quietly, "You're a strange woman, Miss Merritt." "So I've been told." Something shifted in his face, the very edge of something lighter. Not a smile, but the space where one might eventually live. He picked up his coffee and drank it. Outside, the wind moved through the dark, and the ranch was quiet around them. And for a few minutes, they sat together in the kitchen, without the weight of everything pressing quite so hard. It didn't solve anything, but it helped. The second week brought heat so thick it felt like something you had to push through, and with the heat came trouble in the specific shape of Daniel. She'd been watching it build, the way he did his chores with barely contained resentment, the way he answered her in clipped monosyllables and made sure never to meet her eyes. It wasn't the grief of Emma, who burned hot and close to the surface. Daniel's was deeper and colder, and it had been left alone long enough to go underground. It came up on a Wednesday. She had asked him to bring in the laundry before the wind knocked it loose from the line. A simple thing. He'd said he'd do it, and then hadn't. And when she'd stepped outside 20 minutes later to do it herself, he was sitting on the fence, watching her. "I asked you to do this," she said. "I know." He didn't look away. "Why didn't you?" He shrugged, one shoulder. The specific shrug of a 12-year-old boy who is testing a boundary to see what happens when he finds the edge of it. Sarah pulled the first sheet off the line. "You think if you make this hard enough for me, I'll leave?" Silence. "Like the others did?" His jaw tightened. "That's what you're doing, isn't it?" She kept working, kept her voice even. "Making it harder? Hoping I get tired?" "Worked before," he said. She stopped and looked at him. "Yeah," she said. "It probably did. Those women left. And then it was just you and Emma and your daddy and your brothers and sisters. And none of you were any better off than before." She picked up the basket. "You can keep trying it with me if you want. But I'll tell you right now, Daniel, I'm not going anywhere. So you're going to burn yourself out trying." He stared at her. "Or," she said, "you could bring in the laundry." A long moment passed. The wind lifted the hem of her skirt and moved through the dry grass and said nothing helpful. Daniel climbed off the fence, crossed the yard, and started unpinning the laundry. He didn't say anything, neither did she. But when he carried the basket inside and set it on the kitchen table without being asked, she said, "Thank you." And she meant it. And somehow that simple word, said plainly, without any performance around it, made him go still for just a second before he walked back outside. She didn't chase it. She let it sit. It was Lily who broke her that night. Sarah had put the younger ones to bed, a process that involved a story for Grace and Will, 3 glasses of water for Lily that Sarah suspected were tactical rather than genuine, and a brief negotiation with Ruth about whether cats were allowed on beds. They were not. Ruth was not happy about this. The cat was already on the bed. She was tucking Lily in for what was hopefully the final time, when Lily put both small hands on either side of Sarah's face, the way only very young children do, without self-consciousness or hesitation, and looked at her with those solemn, dark eyes. "Sarah," she said. "Are you lonely?" The question hit her like a hand pressed flat against a bruise. She kept her face steady. "What makes you ask that?" "Emma says people who come here are lonely. That's why they come." Lily's hands were still on her face, warm and small and entirely too honest. "Emma says lonely people leave when they find out it's hard here." "Emma says a lot of things." "Are you going to leave?" Sarah covered Lily's small hands with her own, gently lowering them from her face. She held them for a moment. "Lily, I told you I was going to stay." "But are you lonely?" She thought about the room above the feed store in Harlow, the Sundays with nothing to fill them. Dolly Marsh's voice saying, "A woman in your situation," Thomas, somewhere up in Kansas with 3 children who had his eyes. "I was," she said finally. "For a long time I was very lonely." She smoothed the blanket. "I don't think I am anymore." Lily studied her. "Because of us?" "Because of you," Sarah said. Lily pulled her hand free and patted Sarah's once, with the decisive tenderness of someone who had just settled something important. "Good," she said. "Then stay." She closed her eyes. Sarah sat there in the dark for a moment after the child's breathing steadied into sleep. She sat there, and she did not let herself cry, because she had told this child she wasn't lonely anymore, and she was not going to make a liar of herself. But she pressed her hand flat against the blanket over the small, warm shape of Lily's feet, and she stayed like that for a long time. Outside, the night was dark and huge and hot, and somewhere across the ranch, a horse shifted in its stall, and Caleb Stone was walking back from the barn with his lantern and his worries and all the weight of everything he hadn't said yet. And Sarah Merritt, for the first time in 6 years, did not feel like the end of something. She felt like the beginning. 3 weeks in, and Sarah had learned the rhythms of the Stone Ranch, the way you learn a new language. Not all at once, but in pieces, until one morning you wake up and realize you've been thinking in it without noticing. She knew that Caleb left before 4 and came back when the light was gone. She knew that Daniel ate faster when he was worried about something, and slower when he was angry. She knew that Ruth cried quietly, and Grace cried loud, and Will didn't cry at all, which was the one that worried her most. She knew that Emma checked on Lily 3 times every night. She'd heard the soft creak of the floorboard outside Lily's door at 10, at midnight, and again just before dawn, and that Emma never once let any of them see her do it. She knew all of this, and she held it carefully, the way you hold something that isn't yours yet, but might be, someday, if you're patient enough. What she didn't know was Cole Davis. Not until the morning he rode up to the house himself. She heard the horse before she saw him. A heavy, deliberate sound, not the quick trot of someone with honest business. She was in the front room helping Grace with her letters when the sound stopped and boots hit the porch. And then the knock came. Not a question of a knock, a statement. She opened the door. He was a big man, well-dressed for the territory, with a kind of face that had been handsome once and had curdled into something harder. He took his hat off when he saw her, but it was a performance of courtesy, not the real thing. "Morning, ma'am," he said. "Cole Davis. I'm here to see Caleb Stone." "Mr. Stone is working," she said. "Is he expecting you?" "I don't require an appointment." He said it pleasantly. That was the part that put her on guard, the pleasantness. "I'll wait." "I'm afraid that won't be possible today, Mr. Davis. If you'd like to leave a message, I'll see he gets it." Something shifted in his eyes. He looked her over with the particular assessment of a man deciding how much of an obstacle she was going to be. "And you are?" "Sarah Merritt. I manage the household." "Merritt." He said the name like he was filing it. "Well, Miss Merritt, you tell Stone that I came by. And you tell him that my offer has a time limit on it. Generosity doesn't keep forever." He put his hat back on and walked off the porch without hurrying. Sarah shut the door and stood with her hand on it for a moment. Grace had appeared in the doorway of the front room and was watching her with careful eyes. "Who was that man?" Grace asked. "Someone with business to settle," Sarah said. "Come on. We were at the letter G." She didn't tell Caleb that evening. She waited until the children were in bed, until it was just the 2 of them in the kitchen, with the lamp burning low, which had become, in 3 weeks, its own quiet ritual. The part of the day when the noise stopped and the real conversations had room to happen. She told him exactly what Davis had said, word for word, and watched his face go through something complicated. "He came to the house," Caleb said. "He did. He said it to you directly. The part about generosity." "He did." Caleb was quiet for a moment. His hands were flat on the table. "He's never come to the house before. Always sent someone else, or caught me in town." He paused. "Coming here, that's a message." "I know what it was." Sarah looked at him. "Caleb, how bad is it, really? Not the version you tell yourself at night to get to sleep. The actual version." He looked up at the way she'd said his name. She hadn't used it before, always Mr. Stone. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he said, "Bad enough. I've been covering the loan payments, barely. If Davis gets the bank to call it early, and he's got enough pull to try, I'd need to liquidate part of the herd, which means less income next year, which means the year after that gets harder." He stopped. "It's the kind of thing that goes one direction." "Then we stop it going that direction," she said. "Sarah, do you have a full accounting of the ranch finances somewhere? Every asset, every debt, written down?" He looked at her like she'd asked something unexpected. "Clara kept the books. After she passed, I've been keeping track in my head mostly." "In your head," she repeated. "I've had other things to manage." "I know you have." She stood up. "I need you to tell me where Clara kept the ledger." He told her. She found it in the roll-up desk in the back room. A careful, thorough ledger in Clara Stone's precise handwriting, maintained faithfully up until the last 3 months of her life, and then abandoned mid-page in a way that made Sarah's chest ache for a woman she'd never met. She brought it back to the kitchen table, set it down, and looked at Caleb. "I'm going to need you to fill in the last 14 months, she said. "Everything you remember. Tomorrow, after the children are settled." He stared at the ledger for a moment. Then he nodded. "All right. We're going to figure out what you actually have, and then we're going to figure out what to do with it." She closed the ledger. "Davis doesn't get this land, Caleb. Not while I'm here." He looked at her for a long moment. "Why does it matter to you?" he asked. Not challenging, genuine. "You've been here 3 weeks." She thought about Clara Stone's handwriting stopping mid-page. She thought about Lily putting wildflowers on a windowsill for a stranger. She thought about Emma standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms folded, protecting the only version of her mother she had left. "Because it matters to them," she said. "And they matter to me." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Then he looked away first, and something about the fact that he looked away first made her understand something she wasn't ready to think about yet. The next day arrived mean. Daniel came to breakfast with a cut on his knuckle and a look on his face that dared anyone to ask about it. Sarah set a plate in front of him and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "Who hit first?" He glanced up, startled. "The Henley boy," she said. "Isn't it?" His jaw tightened. "He said something about my dad. Said Davis was going to take the ranch and we'd all end up—" He stopped. "Said what?" "Said we'd end up charity cases. In town." His voice went flat and hard. "Said it in front of everyone." Sarah looked at him for a moment. "Did you win?" He blinked. "The fight," she said. "Did you win?" The corner of his mouth moved, almost involuntarily. "Yeah." "Good." She straightened up. "Don't do it again." He stared at her. "You're not going to say I shouldn't have fought?" "I'm saying you solved the immediate problem, but made a larger one. Now the Henley boy's got a reason to keep pushing." She picked up the coffee pot. "Next time he says something, you look him in the eye and you say, 'The Stone Ranch has been standing 40 years, and it'll be standing 40 more.' And then you walk away." She paused. "That'll bother him more than a bloody nose." Daniel was quiet for a moment. Then, "Is that true? The part about 40 more years?" She looked at him. "I'm working on it." Something shifted in his expression. Not softness. Daniel wasn't ready for softness yet. But something else. Something like he just noticed that she was actually there, actually present, actually fighting alongside them rather than just inside their house. He ate his breakfast without another word, but he ate all of it, which was more than he'd done in 2 weeks. Emma found the ledger. Sarah had left it on the kitchen table, open to the page where she'd been working the night before. And she came downstairs to find Emma standing over it, with her arms crossed and her face doing something complicated. "What is this?" Emma asked. "Ranch accounts." "Why are you going through my mother's ledger?" Sarah stopped at the edge of the table. She could have explained. She could have been careful and gentle about it. But something in Emma's voice, the raw protectiveness in it, made her decide that the careful, gentle version would feel like a lie. "Because your daddy is about to lose this ranch if someone doesn't sit down and figure out the numbers," she said. "And that's what I'm doing." Emma went very still. "What do you mean, lose the ranch?" "Cole Davis wants your southeast pasture. He's been pressuring the bank that holds your daddy's loan. If he succeeds, your daddy loses water access, and then he loses the cattle, and then there's nothing to make the loan payments with." She kept her voice flat and factual, because she'd learned that was what Emma could take. Not softness, not hedging. Facts. "I'm trying to find a way to stop that from happening." Emma looked at the ledger, back at Sarah. "Why didn't he tell us?" "He didn't want you to worry." "We're not babies." Emma's voice cracked, just slightly, on the last word. "We have a right to know." "Yes," Sarah said. "You do." Emma looked at her. "So tell me." Sarah pulled out a chair. "Sit down." Emma sat. And Sarah told her. All of it. The loan, the pasture, Davis's visit to the porch, the numbers in the ledger. She told her plainly and without softening it, because Emma was 15 years old and had been running this household since her mother died, and she had earned the truth. When she finished, Emma was quiet for a moment. Her hands were flat on the table, and Sarah recognized the posture because she'd seen it on Caleb the night before. Pressed down, holding something in. "My mama kept those books," Emma said finally. "I know. She was the one who made sure the numbers added up. Daddy's good at the cattle and the land, but Mama—" She stopped. She used to say the ranch had two foundations, the land and the ledger, and you needed both. Sarah didn't say anything. Emma looked at the ledger. Then she looked at Sarah. "I can help," she said. "With the numbers. Mama taught me. I'm good at it." "I know you are," Sarah said. Emma blinked. "How do you know that?" "Because your mother was, and she taught you everything she knew." Sarah slid the ledger an inch closer to Emma. "Show me what you see." Emma looked at the ledger for a moment. Then she leaned forward and started to read. And within 2 minutes, she'd found a discrepancy that Sarah had missed entirely. A payment that had been double-counted in the debit column, which meant the actual debt was smaller than it appeared by nearly $40. "There," Emma said, pointing. "Right there." Sarah looked. She was right. Good eye. Emma sat up a little straighter, and for the first time since Sarah had come to this ranch, the girl looked like herself. Not like someone performing grief or performing strength, but just a smart, capable, grieving kid who had something real to do with her hands. The twist came on a Saturday, and Sarah didn't see it coming. She'd been in town with Caleb, the first time she'd gone into Bitterroot with him, needing to collect a supply order, and she'd been braced for the particular kind of attention that a strange woman accompanying a widower draws in a small town. She'd been right to brace for it. What she hadn't braced for was Martha Greer. Martha was the wife of the local banker, a sharp-faced woman of 50, who came at her in the dry goods store with the specific velocity of a woman who had prepared what she was going to say. "Miss Merritt," she said, with a warmth that had something cold at its center. "We've heard so much about you." "Have you?" Sarah said. "Indeed. It's very admirable what you're doing, stepping in like that." A pause just long enough to be deliberate. "Particularly given, well, given everything." Sarah held very still. "Given what, Mrs. Greer?" Martha's smile didn't waver. "Why, given that the position is so unconventional, a single woman living in a widower's home?" She lowered her voice with exaggerated discretion. "People do talk, you understand. For your sake, I hope Mr. Stone's intentions are honorable." Caleb was 2 aisles away. Sarah could hear him talking to the store clerk. She looked at Martha Greer and kept her voice perfectly level. "Mrs. Greer, I was hired to manage a household and care for 6 children who lost their mother. That is what I am doing. If that gives people something to talk about, then the problem is with the people talking, not with the work." Martha's smile thinned. "And," Sarah continued, just as pleasantly, "if Mr. Stone's loan comes due and your husband's bank decides to call it early based on pressure from Cole Davis, I'll know exactly whose drawing room that conversation happened in." Martha went very still. "Good day," Sarah said, and picked up her supply list and walked to the next aisle. Her hands were shaking slightly. She kept them at her sides. Caleb appeared at the end of the aisle a moment later. He looked at her face and then back in the direction she'd come from. "Martha Greer?" he said. "She had some thoughts she wanted to share." "She usually does." He studied Sarah for a moment. "You all right?" "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I said I'm fine, Caleb." He was quiet for a beat, then quietly. "What did she say to you?" Sarah looked up at him. His face was still and careful, but his jaw was set, and she understood suddenly that he was angry, genuinely angry, in the restrained, contained way of a man who had been raised not to show it. "Nothing I haven't heard before," she said. "Nothing that matters." "It matters," he said. "If someone in this town said something to you because of—" He stopped, started again. "You came here to help my family. If there are consequences for you because of that—" "Caleb." She looked at him directly. "I am 34 years old. I have been managing other people's opinions of me for most of my life. I do not need you to defend me." He held her gaze. "Maybe I want to." The words landed quietly, without drama, which was exactly why they hit as hard as they did. She looked away first this time. They finished the supply run without speaking about it again. But on the wagon ride home, he sat a little closer than the width of the seat required, and neither of them commented on it. It was Will who found her crying. She hadn't cried since she'd arrived on the ranch. Not once. She had cried exactly twice since Thomas left. Once on the night itself, and once on the 1-year anniversary. And she had decided, after that second time, that crying was a luxury she could not afford. But it was Sunday, which had always been her worst day, and she had gone to check on the small patch of garden behind the house where Clara Stone had grown herbs. And she had found, somehow still alive in the heat, a small, stubborn row of lavender. And something about the lavender, about the idea that Clara Stone had planted it and tended it and died, and it had kept growing without her, quietly, insistently, in the dry Texas heat, broke something open in Sarah that she hadn't known was still sealed. She sat down in the dirt next to the lavender, and she cried. Not loudly, just quietly and completely. The way you cry when you've been holding it for long enough that it stops being about any one thing and becomes about everything at once. She heard the small footsteps before she could collect herself. Will appeared around the corner of the house and stopped when he saw her. He was 6 years old and missing his front teeth, and he looked at her with those still, serious eyes that had always worried her. "You're crying," he said. "A little," she admitted. He walked over and sat down next to her in the dirt, with the complete lack of self-consciousness of a 6-year-old who has decided that sitting in dirt is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. He looked at the lavender. "Mama grew that," he said. "I know. Emma says we're not supposed to touch it." "I know. I'm not touching it. I'm just sitting with it." Will considered this. Then he leaned sideways and pressed himself against Sarah's arm, the way small children do, not with any particular ceremony, just with simple, direct weight. "Me too," he said. She put her arm around him. They sat there together in the dirt next to Clara Stone's lavender, and the sun pressed down on them both, and Sarah held that small boy and understood something she had been circling for 3 weeks without quite landing on. She had come to this ranch believing she had nothing to give. That was the story she'd been told, the story Thomas had told her, the story Dolly Marsh had told her, the story she had eventually started telling herself. That a woman who could not make a family from her own body had nothing to offer one. But Lily had put flowers on her windowsill. Daniel had brought in the laundry. Emma had found the error in the ledger and sat up straight for the first time. And Will, 6 years old and grieving in a way he didn't have words for, had just decided that sitting next to her was the right thing to do. They hadn't needed her to give them something she didn't have. They'd needed her to give them something she did. She tightened her arm around Will, just slightly, and he leaned in harder. From inside the house, Emma's voice, calling him for something. He scrambled up immediately, because he was 6 and the word no hadn't fully formed in his vocabulary yet when it came to Emma. But he paused, looked back at Sarah, still sitting in the dirt, and said, with the grave authority of a child delivering important information, "You can come inside too." She looked up at him. "If you want," he added. Then he ran for the door. Sarah sat in the dirt for one more moment. Then she stood up, brushed off her skirt, and followed him inside. And Caleb, who had been standing at the corner of the house longer than she would ever know, watched her go in, watched the straightness come back into her spine and the set return to her shoulders, and stood there alone with a particular, dangerous feeling of a man who had just noticed that the house had started to feel different. Not empty. Full. The Monday after the supply run, Sarah woke up to find a folded note slipped under her bedroom door. She almost stepped on it. She picked it up, unfolded it, and read it, standing there on her bare feet. It was from Emma. "I looked at the ledger again. There's another error on page 41. Also, I think I know who else Daddy could talk to about the loan. Reverend Hollis's brother-in-law works at the county land office. He helped the Pattersons when Davis tried the same thing with them 2 years ago. I didn't say anything before because I didn't know if it mattered. I think it might matter now." Sarah read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and set it on her dresser. Emma had not handed it to her, had not waited to see her reaction, had slid it under the door in the dark, which was its own kind of language. "I'm helping, but I'm not ready to make it a moment yet." Sarah understood. She respected it so much she could have wept. She dressed, went downstairs, and said nothing about the note when Emma came into the kitchen. But she set Emma's breakfast plate down first, before the others, and when Emma glanced up, Sarah held her gaze for just one beat, enough to say, "I got it. Thank you. That's enough." Emma looked back down at her plate, but she didn't fold her arms. Progress. She told Caleb about the Reverend's brother-in-law that evening, framing it as her own research so Emma wouldn't have to explain herself to her father before she was ready. Caleb listened with his elbows on the table and his hands clasped, and that particular stillness he had when something genuinely surprised him. "Jim Hollis," he said. "I know Jim. I never thought to ask him." "You've been managing this alone too long," Sarah said. "You stopped thinking there was anyone to ask." He looked at her. "That's a plain thing to say." "I know." She didn't apologize for it. He was quiet for a moment. "I'll ride out to see Reverend Hollis tomorrow. See if Jim's willing to talk." He paused. "Sarah, if this works—" "It might not work," she said immediately. "Let's not build a house on it yet. Let's just make the visit and see what's there." "I know, but if it does—" He stopped himself, looked at the table, looked back up at her. "I don't know how to say thank you for something this size." "Then don't," she said. "Not yet. Wait until there's actually something to be thankful for." He almost smiled. She had noticed, over 5 weeks, that he almost smiled quite often. The actual smile was rarer and quieter, and it did something to the whole architecture of his face that she tried not to think about too directly. She poured herself more coffee and did not think about it. Caleb rode out to see the Reverend on Tuesday. He came back that evening looking like a man who had been given a lifeline and was not yet sure he deserved to grab it. Jim Hollis had agreed to meet with them the following week. He had experience with Davis's land tactics. Apparently, the man had tried this same squeeze on 4 other small ranches in the county over the past 3 years. 2 had sold. 2 had found ways to fight. Jim Hollis had helped both of the ones that fought. Sarah listened to all of it and felt the first solid thing shift into place. "He thinks we have a case," Caleb said. "If we can document the pressure Davis has been putting on the bank, witnesses, dates, anything in writing, Jim can take it to the county commissioner. Make it a pattern of coercion rather than just one man's business dispute." "Daniel," Sarah said. Caleb frowned. "What?" "The Henley boy said it in front of the whole schoolyard. That Davis was going to take the ranch, which means Davis has been saying it where people can hear him. Which means he's been saying it long enough and loud enough that it got to children." She looked at Caleb. "That's documented arrogance. People in town have been hearing Davis talk about this land like it's already his. That's witnesses." Caleb stared at her. "You got that from Daniel." "Daniel told me about the fight. I've been thinking about it since." He kept staring for a moment. Then he exhaled. The long, slow exhale of a man releasing something he'd been holding for months. "How long have you been working this out?" "Since the day Davis came to the porch." She looked at him steadily. "I told you, this land isn't going anywhere." He looked at her with something in his eyes that she didn't have a clean name for. It wasn't gratitude exactly, or not only that. It was the look of a person who had been alone for a very long time and had just realized, fully and finally, that they weren't anymore. She looked away before it could settle into something she'd have to address. "Tell me what Jim Hollis needs from us," she said. "Let's make a list." The list kept them up until well past midnight. It was the first time they'd sat across from each other with a common purpose that had nothing to do with the children or the household. Just the two of them, with Clara's ledger and a fresh sheet of paper, and the problem laid out between them like a map. Caleb knew the land and the cattle and the history of every handshake agreement he'd ever made with anyone in the county. Sarah knew the numbers and the patterns and which gaps in the ledger corresponded to which pressures from Davis. They worked well together. She noticed it without wanting to notice it. The way they moved around each other's sentences. The way he'd say half a thing, and she'd pick up the other half. The way neither of them had to explain their reasoning from the beginning, because they'd been in enough evening conversations to understand how the other thought. It was almost 1 in the morning when he sat back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands and said, "Clara would have liked you." She went still. He said it simply, without looking at her, looking at the table, or past it, like it was something he'd been holding for a while and had just decided to set down. She was practical like you. She didn't have patience for nonsense, and she didn't perform things she didn't feel. He paused. And she loved those kids the way you do, not like they were her job, like they were hers. Sarah's throat was tight. She kept her voice steady. "You don't have to—" "I know I don't." He looked up. "I want to." He held her gaze. "I need you to understand that when I say this isn't just about the help. It hasn't been just about the help for a while now." The kitchen was very quiet. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. She understood exactly what he was saying, and she understood exactly why it terrified her. Not because she didn't feel anything in return, but because she felt too much. And feeling too much in this particular direction had a specific history for her, that ended with a packed bag and an empty house and a doctor in Abilene saying the word barren like it was a simple fact. "Caleb," she said carefully, "I need you to know something." "All right. I can't—" She stopped, steadied herself. "I was married before. My husband left because I couldn't give him children. The doctor told me I never would." She kept her voice flat and factual, because that was the only way she could say it. "I know that's not, Sarah. I need to say it first, before you think you're saying something and find out later you were missing the full picture." He looked at her steadily. "I have 6 children." "I know that." 6. The youngest of whom dragged you into the dirt on Sunday and sat on you like a piece of furniture. She blinked. "He didn't. He sat next to me. He didn't—" "I saw, Sarah." His voice was quiet. "I was at the corner of the house. I saw the whole thing." He paused. "I'm not looking for a woman to give me more children. I'm looking at a woman who spent her Sunday sitting in the dirt with my son next to Clara's lavender because he needed someone to sit with him." He stopped. "The rest of it doesn't change that." She looked at him. Her chest ached with something complicated and enormous. "It might," she said. "Someday." "Maybe," he said. "Someday is a long way off. I'm talking about right now." He looked at her steadily. "Right now, I'm asking if you'd let this be something. Not tomorrow, not all at once. Just something." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "Ask me again when the ranch is still standing." He looked at her, and this time the almost smile became the real one, quiet and slow and completely different from any expression she'd seen on him before. "Fair enough," he said. She gathered the papers and did not let herself smile until she turned away toward the kitchen counter. The next morning brought Cole Davis, and he did not come alone. There were 2 men with him this time. One she recognized from town, a man named Briggs, who worked odd jobs and had the look of someone who'd been hired for the specific purpose of standing large in a doorway. The other she didn't know. Caleb was already outside when they rode up. He'd been coming in from the barn when he heard the horses, and he stopped in the yard and waited with his arms at his sides, and that particular stillness that meant he was angry in a controlled and deliberate way. Sarah came to the porch without being asked. She stood at the top of the steps. Behind her, she could feel Emma in the doorway. "Davis," Caleb said. "Stone?" Davis dismounted like a man who owned the ground he stepped on. I came for your answer. You've had my answer 3 times. I've had a lot of stubbornness 3 times. That's different. Davis looked at the house, looked at Sarah on the porch, looked back at Caleb. I hear you've been talking to Jim Hollis. Caleb didn't move. Word travels fast. I have friends. Davis's voice was pleasant. It was always pleasant. That was the thing that made Sarah's skin tighten. Jim's a decent man, but he doesn't know what he's getting into. The bank is going to call that loan, Stone. 30 days. I've already had the conversation. Caleb went very still. 30 days, Davis repeated, like he was doing him a favor by saying it clearly. That's not enough time to sell cattle at anything but a loss. We both know it. I'm offering you full market value on the pasture, which is more than you'll get when the bank forces your hand. He paused. Take the deal. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Get off my land. Davis's pleasantness cooled by 1 degree. Just 1. Don't make this harder than it needs to. I said, get off my land. Caleb's voice didn't rise. It dropped, which was somehow worse. You come back here without an invitation, I'll be the one doing the talking to the county commissioner. About the way you've been acquiring parcels in this county. About the conversations you've been having with the bank. About the things you've been saying in public that have been getting back to school children. He took 1 step forward. I've been documenting it, Davis. Every date, every word, every witness I can put a name to. You want to take me to court? Go ahead. Let's both open our records and see which one of us comes out cleaner. Davis stared at him. The pleasantness was gone now. Underneath it was something harder and colder that was probably closer to the truth. 30 days, he said. Goodbye, Mr. Davis. Davis looked at the house 1 more time. His eyes moved to Sarah on the porch, and she looked back at him without blinking. And whatever he saw in her face he didn't like. Because he turned away first. He remounted, said something quiet to the 2 men with him, and rode off. The yard was silent. Then Emma said, from the doorway behind Sarah, in a voice that was not as steady as she wanted it to be, Did he mean it? About 30 days? Caleb turned and looked at his daughter. His face was exhausted and honest. He might have the bank's ear, he said. That part might be true. Then what do we do? We go see Jim Hollis, Sarah said. She turned around and looked at Emma directly. Tomorrow. You're coming with us. Emma blinked. Me? You found the ledger errors. You know the numbers better than anyone. Jim Hollis needs to understand what this ranch actually looks like financially, not the version Davis has been telling the bank. You're going to help us show him. Emma looked at her father. He looked back at her with something in his expression she hadn't seen in a long time. Not protection, not management. Trust. She's right, he said simply. Emma stood in the doorway for a moment, visibly recalibrating something. Then she nodded once. All right, she said. I'll go. Daniel had appeared at the edge of the barn. Ruth and Grace were in the window. Will was on the porch step, looking up at Sarah. Is the bad man going to take the ranch? Will asked. Sarah crouched down to his level. She looked him straight in the eye. No, she said, he is not. Will looked at her with those serious eyes. How do you know? Because we're not going to let him. He held her gaze for a moment with the profound assessment of a 6-year-old deciding whether to believe something. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back inside. The meeting with Jim Hollis happened on Friday. Sarah had spent 3 evenings preparing, organizing the ledger, writing a clear summary of the financial picture, documenting every date and incident involving Davis that she could verify through Caleb's memory or public record. She cross-referenced Daniel's account of the schoolyard incident with what she'd heard from two women in town who'd mentioned Davis talking about the stone land with what she now recognized as deliberate, calculated openness. Jim Hollis was a lean, careful man with the patient eyes of someone who dealt in details for a living. He spread their documents on his desk and read everything before he said a single word. When he looked up, he looked at Emma first. "You compiled this?" he asked, nodding at the financial summary. Emma met his eyes. "With Miss Merritt." "It's thorough work." He looked at Caleb. "Davis's claim to the bank is that you're a bad credit risk, that the ranch has been mismanaged since your wife passed." He tapped the summary. "This says otherwise. What I need is to get this in front of the right people before the 30-day notice lands officially." He paused. "You said he made statements in public about the ranch changing hands. I need those witnesses in writing." "I can get them," Sarah said. Jim looked at her. "You've been here, what, a month?" "6 weeks." "And you know who'll sign a statement?" "I know who in this town is tired of Cole Davis acting like he owns everything in it," she said. "That's a longer list than you might expect." Jim Hollis looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. "Where'd you find her?" Caleb looked at Sarah. Something moved in his face, quiet and certain, and in no hurry to hide itself. "She answered an ad," he said. She got 4 signatures in 2 days. Martha Greer was not one of them, but Martha Greer's husband, the banker, turned out to be a man who was deeply uncomfortable with what Davis had been asking him to do, and deeply relieved to have an official channel through which to be uncomfortable. He didn't sign a statement, but he made a phone call to the county commissioner's office that turned out to matter more than a signature would have. The dry goods store owner signed. The school teacher signed, because the Henley boy had bragged to her directly about what Davis had said, which meant she had first-hand knowledge. Tom Grady, who'd driven Sarah from Harlow 6 weeks ago, and who turned out to have seen Davis ride the boundary of the stone property at least twice in the past year, making notes, signed without being asked twice. Sarah came back to the ranch on Saturday evening with 4 signed statements and an appointment for Caleb with the county commissioner set for the following Thursday. She set the papers on the kitchen table. Caleb looked at them for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "Sarah." "I know," she said. "No, I need to say it. Caleb, it's not done yet. Davis still has 30 days. I'm not talking about Davis." His voice was quiet and direct. "I'm talking about you. I'm talking about the fact that you have been fighting for this family since the second week you were here, and you did it without being asked, and you did it without—" He stopped, steadied himself. "You did it like it was yours to fight for." She looked at him. "Is it?" he asked. "Is it yours?" The kitchen was quiet. Outside, she could hear Ruth and Grace arguing over something in the yard, and Will's voice rising above them in a referee's tone that she recognized as borrowed directly from her own. And from somewhere upstairs, Emma's footsteps, purposeful and steady, moving from one room to the next, managing the household the way her mother had, the way she'd been doing since she was 13. 6 weeks. That was all it had been. And the answer to his question, the true answer, had been building in her since the moment Lily put wildflowers on her windowsill, and she'd stood there looking at them and understood that she was not going to be able to keep her distance from this. "Yes," she said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in his hands the way a man does when he has been thinking about doing something for a long time and has finally decided to stop thinking about it. He looked at her for just a moment, 1 beat to be sure, and she looked back at him without looking away. And then he kissed her. And it was not a performance of anything. It was just quiet and real and exactly what it was. When they stepped back from each other, She kept her hands on his arms for a moment, steadying herself against the specific vertigo of wanting something so much and having it actually be there. "The 30 days," she said. "I know." His hands were still on her face. "We're not done yet." "No," he said. "We're just starting." From the doorway of the kitchen, which neither of them had been watching, came the very deliberate, very pointed sound of Emma Stone clearing her throat. They stepped apart. Emma stood in the doorway with her arms folded and her face doing something complicated that was trying very hard to be stern and failing in a way that looked, from certain angles, almost exactly like relief. She looked at her father. She looked at Sarah. She looked at the papers on the table. "Did you get the signatures?" she asked. "4 of them," Sarah said. Emma nodded. "Good." She looked at her father for one more moment. Then she looked at Sarah, and something passed between them that was quieter and more important than anything that had been said out loud in the whole 6 weeks. Emma's arms dropped slightly from their fold. Not all the way, but enough. "Supper's getting cold," Emma said. She turned and walked back toward the stove. Sarah looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Sarah. "Go on, then," he said quietly. She went. The Thursday meeting with the county commissioner arrived the way all important days do. Quietly, without ceremony, dressed up as ordinary morning. Sarah was up before 4. She had the coffee made before Caleb came downstairs, and when he walked into the kitchen and found her already dressed and sitting at the table with the documents organized in a neat stack, he stopped in the doorway and just looked at her for a moment. "You sleep at all?" he asked. "Some," she said, which was not entirely a lie. He sat down, poured his coffee, and looked at the stack of papers. Neither of them said anything for a while. Outside, the ranch was still dark, and the only sounds were the cattle settling in the far pasture and the particular silence of a house full of sleeping children. "Whatever happens today," Caleb said finally. "Don't," Sarah said. He looked at her. "Don't start a sentence with 'whatever happens,'" she said. "I don't want a contingency plan right now. I want to go in there and win." He held her gaze. Then he set down his cup and nodded once. "All right," he said. "Let's go win." Emma appeared at the top of the stairs 10 minutes later, already dressed, her hair braided tight, the ledger summary under her arm, and her jaw set in the exact same angle as her father's when he'd told Davis to get off his land. She came downstairs without a word, took one look at the papers, added her own neatly written summary to the top of the stack, and said, "Tom's already got the wagon ready. I told him 5:30." Caleb looked at his daughter. Something moved in his face, pride so deep it had gone quiet. "When did you talk to Tom?" "Last night." She looked at him steadily. "We're not losing this ranch, Daddy." It was the first time in 6 weeks that Sarah had heard Emma call him that. Not father, not the careful distance of his full name. Daddy. Simple and direct, the way it had probably sounded when she was 7. Caleb's throat worked. "No," he said. "We're not." The county commissioner's office was in a building that smelled like old paper and boot leather, and the specific weight of decisions that had been made and lived with for a long time. Commissioner Hayes was a deliberate man in his 60s, with the patient, unhurried manner of someone who had seen most kinds of trouble and was not easily impressed by it. He read everything, all of it. Jim Hollis sat to their left, and Hayes read without comment for 20 minutes, while the 4 of them sat in their chairs and the clock on the wall ticked the kind of ticks that feel like they cost something. Then Hayes set the papers down and looked up. "Mr. Stone," he said, "is it your testimony that Cole Davis made direct statements about acquiring this property before any official transaction was proposed?" "It is," Caleb said. "And you have a witness, Your hired hand, Grady, who observed Davis surveying your boundary lines without invitation? Twice, Caleb said. Tom can swear to the dates. Hayes looked at Emma's financial summary. This ledger analysis. Who prepared this? Emma sat up slightly. I did, with Miss Merritt. He looked at Emma for a moment. She was 15 years old, and she did not flinch. This is careful work, he said. My mother kept those books for 11 years, Emma said. I know every line of them. Hayes was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at Jim Hollis. You're prepared to file the coercion complaint? I am, Jim said. Today, if you'll co-sign. Hayes looked at the papers again. He was silent long enough that Sarah could feel Caleb's stillness beside her. That controlled, absolute stillness of a man holding himself together by pure will. Then Hayes picked up his pen. He signed the document. He slid it across to Jim Hollis, who co-signed it without fanfare, folded it, and placed it in his case. The bank will receive formal notice that any acceleration of Mr. Stone's loan under current circumstances will be reviewed as a potential act of coordinated coercion, Hayes said. That won't stop Davis from making an offer. But it means if he keeps pushing through the bank, he's doing it on record. He looked at Caleb. Manage your payments. Don't give him a clean financial argument. Do that, and I think you'll find the pressure lets up considerably. Caleb shook his hand. Jim shook his hand. Sarah shook his hand. Emma shook his hand too, and Hayes looked at her when she did it. A long, assessing look, and said, How old are you? 15, Emma said. You'll make a fine businesswoman, he said. Emma looked at Sarah, just briefly, then looked back at Hayes. Thank you, sir, she said. They didn't talk much on the wagon ride home, not because there was nothing to say, but because some things needed a moment of quiet before they could become words. It was Emma who broke the silence, about halfway home, staring out at the flat, sun-hammered land. He's not going to stop, she said. Davis, this slows him down. It doesn't stop him. No, Sarah agreed. It doesn't. So we have to actually fix the finances, not just defend them. Emma turned and looked at her. That $40 I found in the ledger, that's not nothing. I think if we look at the whole last 14 months carefully, there might be more errors, or more places where money was being managed by instinct instead of strategy. Caleb glanced at his daughter sideways. When did you become a banker? When Mama stopped being able to keep the books and nobody else did, Emma said without bitterness. Just fact. The words landed and sat there. Caleb looked out at the road. Then we do it together, he said quietly. Emma nodded once. Then she looked back at the land, and Sarah watched the girl's face in profile, the jaw still set, the eyes still careful, and saw, underneath all of it, the very faint outline of something that might eventually become peace. Not yet, but it was in there. The twist came before supper. They arrived home to find Daniel sitting on the front porch steps, with a look on his face that Sarah had learned to read as the specific expression he wore when he'd done something he was genuinely uncertain about. He stood up when the wagon pulled in. There was a man here, he said. Caleb climbed down. What man? Said his name was Reeves. He works for the bank. Daniel's jaw was tight. He came with papers. I didn't let him in. I told him Mr. Stone wasn't home and that he'd have to come back. He paused. He left the papers anyway. Said it was a formal notice. He held out an envelope. I read it. I know I wasn't supposed to, but I read it. Caleb took the envelope, opened it. Sarah watched his face. He read it once, then again. Then he handed it to her without a word. It was not a 30-day notice. It was a letter informing Caleb Stone that his loan had been reviewed and that, in light of his account standing, the bank was extending his payment period by 60 days and reducing his current interest rate by 0.5 percentage point, effective immediately, pending a formal review of his account that had been requested by the county commissioner's office. Sarah read it twice. She looked up at Caleb. He was staring at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not relief exactly. Something bigger and less manageable than relief. "Hayes moved fast," she said. "He moved today," Caleb said. "Same day." He didn't want Davis to get ahead of it. Daniel looked between them. "Is that good?" "That," Sarah said, "is very good." Daniel processed this. Then he said, with the cautious, almost suspicious tone of a boy who had been disappointed by good news before, "So, we're okay?" "We're better than we were this morning," Sarah said. "That's real. The rest we keep working on." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the letter in her hands. Then he looked at his father. "I told the man to come back," he said. "I didn't know if I should let him in or not. Was that right?" "That was exactly right," Caleb said. Daniel's shoulders dropped a fraction. Not much, but enough. "Okay," he said. And then, because he was 12 and had a limit on how much emotional weight he could carry at one time, he turned and went back inside. And from the hallway, they could hear him telling Ruth and Grace about the man with the papers, in a voice that was trying very hard to sound like it hadn't mattered to him. Emma looked at Sarah. "He stood in that doorway," Emma said, "for 45 minutes. I watched from the window. That man tried to come in twice, and Daniel just didn't move." Sarah held her gaze. "He's a stone," she said. Emma's chin lifted, just slightly. "Yeah," she said. "He is." That night at supper, something was different. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a celebration. Sarah had been careful about that, because she knew that one good day in a long fight wasn't a victory, and she didn't want the children building something fragile on it. But there was a quality to the noise at the table that had changed. The kind of change that happens slowly, and then all at once. Like the way summer shifts into something else, without you noticing the exact moment it turns. Will talked through most of the meal, which was normal. Ruth and Grace argued about the cat, which was also normal. Daniel ate steadily and without the compressed, shouldered tension he'd been carrying for weeks. Emma passed the cornbread to Sarah before being asked, which was not normal and was therefore remarkable. Caleb watched all of it from the head of the table, with the expression of a man taking inventory of something valuable. After the dishes were done and the younger ones were herded upstairs, Sarah was banking the kitchen fire when she heard a small sound behind her and turned to find Grace in the doorway in her nightgown, clutching something to her chest. "I made you something," Grace said. She was 7, and 7-year-olds delivered gifts with a seriousness that no other age can replicate. She held it out. It was a drawing, a house with a porch, stick figures, many of them, clustered together in front of the house. One slightly taller than the others, with a skirt. "That's you," Grace said, pointing to the tall one. "And that's all of us. I drew it because—" She screwed up her face in concentration, searching for the words. "Because I wanted you to see what it looks like from outside, when we're all together." Sarah took the drawing with both hands. She looked at it for a long moment. 8 stick figures in front of a house, all of them together. "It's beautiful," she said. Her voice was steady. She was very proud of how steady it was. Grace beamed with the complete, uncomplicated satisfaction of someone who has done exactly the right thing. Then she turned and ran back upstairs before Sarah could say anything else. Sarah stood in the kitchen, holding the drawing. She heard Caleb's step behind her, and she didn't turn around. "She's been working on it all week," he said. "Wouldn't let anyone see it." Sarah set the drawing carefully on the table. "She's a good kid." "They're all good kids." A pause. "They're better kids than they were 2 months ago. And I know why." She turned around then. He was standing close. Closer than he usually stood, which was already closer than he'd been in the early weeks. A distance that had narrowed so gradually she'd barely tracked it. "The commissioner's letter changes things," she said. Not deflecting, just stating. "It does," he agreed. "It means we have time to do this right. The finances, the ranch, all of it." He held her gaze. "It also means I have time to ask you something properly, instead of in the middle of a crisis at midnight." She waited. "Stay," he said. "Not as the woman I hired, not as help." He paused. "With me, with us. Permanently, if you'll have it." The kitchen was very quiet. Sarah thought about the room above the feed store. She thought about Thomas, somewhere in Kansas. She thought about the doctor's voice, and Dolly Marsh's voice, and all the voices that had added up over 6 years into the story she'd been told about who she was and what she was worth. She thought about Lily's hands on her face, Will in the dirt, Daniel at the fence, Emma's note slipped under a door in the dark, Grace's drawing of 8 stick figures in front of a house. She thought about Clara Stone's lavender, still growing. "I can't give you more children," she said, one more time, because she needed him to hear it in the same breath as her answer, so there was no separating the two. "I know," he said, "and I'm not Clara." "I know that too." His voice was steady. "I'm not asking you to be." "6 children is a lot," he said. "I know. I've met them." She almost laughed. Almost. She pressed her lips together. "Sarah." He took her hand, both of hers and both of his, the same way he'd looked at the letter, like something he intended to hold and not put down. "I'm asking you to be exactly what you already are. To them. To me." He paused. "You've been home since the 2nd week. I think you know that. I think you've known it longer than I have." She had. She had known it since she sat in the dirt next to Clara's lavender, with Will's weight against her arm, and understood that she had never been incomplete. She had been waiting for the right place to be whole in. "Yes," she said. He exhaled, one long breath that carried something in it she recognized, because she'd felt it herself. The specific exhale of a person who has been carrying a weight so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to set it down. He brought her hands up and pressed them briefly to his mouth. Not a performance, just a quiet, direct acknowledgement of the thing that had just shifted between them. Then he looked at her. "We tell the children tomorrow," she said. "Tomorrow," he agreed. "Emma first." "Emma first," he said. And the fact that they both understood this without discussion, that Emma had to be first, had to be given the respect of knowing before her siblings, had to be brought in rather than informed, said everything about how much had changed in 8 weeks. They told Emma the next morning before the others were up. Sarah had expected resistance, had prepared for it, the way you prepare for weather, not hoping for it, but ready. Emma sat at the kitchen table and listened. She looked at her father. She looked at Sarah. Her face was doing that careful, complicated work it always did when something mattered enough to require management. Then she said, "Are you asking my opinion or telling me?" "We're telling you," Caleb said, "but your opinion matters." Emma was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands. Then she looked up at Sarah directly. Not challenging, not protecting, not testing. Just looking. "She's not replacing Mama," Emma said. Not a question. "No," Sarah said. "I'm not. I can't. I wouldn't." "She's something different," Emma said, still looking at her. "Something new." "Yes." Emma held her gaze for a long time, long enough that Sarah felt the full weight of it. 8 weeks of watching, measuring, waiting to be let down. 8 weeks of a girl who had lost the most important person in her world, deciding, slowly and carefully, and with every right to be wrong about it, whether to let another person into the place that had been left empty. Then Emma nodded. One nod. Clean and final, the way she did everything. "Okay," she said. She stood up and picked up the coffee pot and refilled all 3 cups without being asked. Then she sat back down and looked at the ledger summary on the table. "We should go over the accounts this morning, before the little ones get up." Caleb looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at Emma. "Yes," Sarah said. "We should." They told the others at breakfast. Will accepted the news with the serene, practical simplicity of a 6-year-old and immediately asked whether Sarah would still make hotcakes on Sundays. Grace started crying within 30 seconds. Not sad crying, the overwhelmed kind, the kind that comes when something you hoped for turns out to be real. Ruth said, "Finally," with the flat authority of a 9-year-old who had clearly been waiting for the adults to catch up with what was already obvious. Daniel didn't say anything for a moment. Then he looked at Sarah across the table. His jaw worked. "You said you weren't going anywhere," he said. "I did." "That first week, when I was—" He stopped. "You said you weren't going anywhere." "I remember." He looked at her for one more beat. Then he looked down at his plate and said, "Good," in the specific, low-key, determinedly unbothered voice of a 12-year-old boy who is deeply, profoundly relieved and refuses to make a scene about it. Sarah looked at the table. She did not let herself smile. She absolutely did not let herself smile. Lily, who had been listening to the whole conversation with her chin in her hands and her eyes moving from face to face, looked up at Sarah and said with tremendous satisfaction, "I told you to stay." "You did," Sarah said. "And you stayed." "I did," Lily nodded. "I knew you would." She picked up her fork. "Can I have more hotcakes?" 3 weeks later, on a Sunday morning when the heat had finally broken enough to feel like something other than punishment, Caleb Stone stood on the porch and watched his children in the yard. Will was chasing the barn cat with the kind of total commitment that only 6-year-olds possess. Ruth and Grace were arguing about something that had the shape of a game but the intensity of a legal dispute. Daniel was at the fence, talking to Tom Grady, in a way that looked, from a distance, like 2 men discussing actual work. Emma was sitting on the porch steps with a ledger in her lap, one leg folded under her, pencil behind her ear, reading a column of numbers with a focused expression that meant she'd found something. And Sarah was at the end of the porch, hanging the Sunday wash on the line strung between the posts. And she was singing, very quietly, not performing it, just the way people sing when they've forgotten they're doing it. Something low and unhurried that Caleb didn't recognize, but felt like it belonged to the morning. He stood there and looked at all of it. Emma looked up from the ledger and caught him watching. She read his face the way she read everything, quickly, accurately. She looked at Sarah. She looked back at her father. She did not say anything, but she moved over on the porch step, just slightly, making room. He walked over and sat down beside her. She showed him the ledger without preamble. "I found another $32. Right here. This entry was counted against us twice." She pointed to the line. "Davis doesn't have as clean a case as he thinks. Not if we keep closing these gaps." "You're going to close every one of them," he said. "I know," she said simply. She was 15, and she had her mother's handwriting and her father's jaw, and she was going to be formidable. Already was, if he was honest. And he thought about Clara suddenly, clearly, with the specific love of a man who has stopped running from the memory and can look at it straight. Clara would have seen this coming long before he did. Clara had always been faster than him at understanding what was necessary. He thought she would have said, "Good," in that plain, sufficient way she'd had. Emma turned the page of the ledger and kept working. Sarah finished with the wash and came down the porch steps, and Will intercepted her before she made it 3 feet, wrapping himself around her leg with the absolute confidence of a child who has decided that this person belongs to him. She laughed, properly this time, the full laugh that Caleb had been cataloging without meaning to, and she picked him up and said something into his hair that made him shriek and wiggle and hold on tighter. Caleb watched her hold his son. He thought about the letter she'd answered in the back room of a general store in Harlow on a sweltering summer morning, and the 2 careful drafts she'd written before she found the words that sounded like herself. He thought about a woman who had been told she was incomplete and had carried that story for 6 years until she set it down in the dirt next to a row of lavender, and a child who didn't know any better than to simply sit beside her. He thought about all the ways a family could be made. Not just one way, not only the obvious way, but out of need and stubbornness and shared tables and ledger errors caught at midnight, and a girl who slid notes under a door in the dark, and a boy who stood in a doorway for 45 minutes because he decided the house was worth guarding. Out of a woman who showed up when she was needed and stayed because she chose to. Sarah put Will down, looked up, and found Caleb watching her from the porch. She held his gaze across the yard, that look they had by now, steady and unhurried, the look of 2 people who no longer need to say everything out loud. She tilted her head just slightly, the way she did when she was asking a question without words. He shook his head. "Nothing's wrong," and lifted his hand toward her, palm up. She crossed the yard. She walked up the porch steps and sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched, and she didn't look at the land, or the children, or the wide Texas sky pressing down on all of it. She just sat there, present and still, and exactly where she had decided to be. Emma, without looking up from the ledger, said, $32. "I heard you," Caleb said. "We should write it down officially, for the commissioner's file." "After church," Sarah said. Emma considered this. "Fine." She turned the page. "After church." Will came barreling back up the porch steps and flung himself between the 2 of them with total physical confidence, grabbing one of Sarah's hands and one of Caleb's, and holding both with the grip of a child staking a claim. Nobody moved him. The sun came down on the stone ranch the way it always had. Indifferent, enormous, without mercy. But the people under it were not the same people they'd been 8 weeks ago, and the house behind them held something it had been missing for 14 months. Something that couldn't be named in one word, but could be felt the moment you walked through the door. Sarah Merritt had come to Bitterroot with 2 bags and a small trunk, and no certainty of anything. She had answered an ad placed by a man who needed help, and gotten something neither of them had thought to ask for. She was home. Not the way you arrive at a place, the way you finally stop leaving one.